Welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is dedicated Le'il Nishmas Reb Gedaliah Yirxamiel ben Michal Olav Shalom by his family. His Yahrtzeit is Yud Adar, and his neshama should have an Aliyah. This episode is sponsored by the Guardians community, which is hosted on WhatsApp and Telegram. Rare books tell the story of our past. The Guardians, a new initiative led by Gnozim, is where collectors, book lovers, and history enthusiasts come together to explore, learn, and preserve Jewish treasures. On The Guardians, you'll gain access to exclusive insights into rare books and manuscripts, expert knowledge on collecting, preserving, and identifying rare books and manuscripts, auction previews, exclusive member-only auctions, discovery alerts about historic finds, private exhibitions and events, and the ability to ask experts collecting advice, evaluations, and much more. To join, click the link in the show's notes below. To sponsor an episode of the podcast or to support the podcast, please email me svarimchatter@gmail.com, or you can find the links in the show's notes below. You can also find the link in the show notes to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new Svarim, new books, book deals, and the like. And finally, if you can please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, wherever it is that you listen, whether on Apple, 24/6, Spotify, please do so. And with that, enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Rabbi Yisroel Cohen, who is the author of a number of books. And the first book that he wrote is what he was previously on the podcast for, is Mitzrayim, Midrash, and Myth, about Egyptian mythology and Midrash and the Torah. The new book that he just published now is titled Nephilim, Giants and Fallen Angels, according to Chazal, published with Mosaic Press, and that'll be the subject of this podcast episode about Nephilim. So thank you, Yisroel, for joining me once again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So the first book made sense in the sense that Egyptian mythology, it's relevant in that it comes up whenever we learn Shemais, every Pesach, and we actually did the podcast for Pesach. However, this episode, Nephilim, and I'll let you define what Nephilim is, maybe fallen angels, but when Nephilim is more of an esoteric topic, it's alluded to, we'll talk about it in Bereshis a little bit, Rashi and Bamidbar, but it's not something that in the Jewish tradition, it's not something that one always comes across. Why did you decide that you were going to write a book and research the topic of Nephilim?
So first of all, Nachi, I want to thank you for my last podcast. I think it went very well, and Baruch Hashem, word got out there. But I want to say that this book is really like a second part, a part two to the Mitzrayim book. When I was researching the Egypt book, I obviously spent significant time, studying and learning about Egyptian myth. And while I was doing that, I sort of thought came to me of like, what is Jewish myth? Do the Jewish nation, does the Jewish people, does the Torah have any mythical traditions? And obviously, we have extensive sets of mythology, and the Nephilim, I think, is the oldest, longest myth that exists in the Torah. And of course, I naturally jumped into the Nephilim myth.
I think this came up in the last episode, but I think it's very important to start because of what you just said, mythology and myth. And we should define what a myth is, what mythology means, especially as you say, it's a myth in the Torah. The Torah, everything is Torah, Menashmai. What does it mean a myth? So especially when it comes to the Torah, when we say myth and mythology, what do we mean?
Yeah, so myth is obviously one of these words that are highly misunderstood. For the most part, when you say something is a myth, you say it's, it's not true, it's stupidity, it's narishkeit. But of course, myth has a much deeper meaning. Myth is a collection of stories and ideas with a very deep meaning. I always say the difference between a myth and a parable, between a myth and a mashal, is in a mashal, the objective is to understand the lesson. Basically, when you go to the Gemara, you learn Gemara, mashal, blah, blah, blah. The point is to get the lesson. The point is not to retain the mashal. But myth, the story is of its importance. So much so that sometimes it even supersedes the messaging. And that's a very, very important point in understanding. It's very vital to understand this point whenever you discuss mythology, is to know that not necessarily it replaces the facts, but rather it's how to view the facts. And the problem is when myth becomes the literal, when you take the myth as literal, then you already go into places of Avodah Zarah, and that's obviously what we try to avoid. But we have to be very clear that myth isn't a contradiction to whether something did or didn't happen. Myth is the way to view the thing that happened. It's very funny. Like, I get an email at least once a week from someone where, like, they ask me, like, are you saying the Mabul didn't happen, or are you saying Brias Olam didn't happen? Well, Chas v'Shalom, that's not what a myth is. And that's not what we're trying to do in this book. The point of myth is how to view the events and how to relay the events in a way that these stories permeate many different topics and eventually take on a life of their own throughout the entire Tanakh, for that matter.
So, essentially, what you're saying is a myth doesn't mean fake, false, not true. That, as you know, of course, everything in the Torah is factual, but we're not saying that. You're saying it just means clarify a little bit more what you mean.
So again, for example, Kabbalah. Well, let's take that as a topic. It's a very big, a very interesting. I don't know. Just to jump off topic here, like Tzimtzum Kipshutai or Tzimtzum Lot Kipshutai. And these type of ideas, how the Eibishter, removed himself from the physicality of this world. But regardless, all these different mashalim and all these different wordings that we're going to use, of course, everybody agrees is not Kipshuta. So, anytime we discuss anything that has to do with the Eibishter, or has to do with God, obviously cannot be taken literal. And if you believe in any type of literal being, you end up being like that Ravid's comment on the Rambam again in Hilchos Tshuva, right? So we obviously try to avoid any materialistic relations with God. But there still is a need for a story. There's still a need for language and words to try to help mankind comprehend the uncomprehendable. So whereas Kabbalah came up with these type of ideas that they have with the spheres, etc., prior to that, from the beginning of time, there's these long-standing traditional stories to how man came into being, to how God relates to man, man's purpose on the world. And these ideas are vital to the existence of everything. Literally the existence of everything. And as we'll see in this podcast, we'll discuss in my book, the idea of a hero, the idea of people who are able to overcome evil, the idea of good and bad. All these type of grandiose ideas were once placed into the world of myth, where these traditions were able to be passed on and on for eternity.
So let's start with Nephilim. And Nephilim is something that comes up in Bereshis, Perek Vav, Pasuk, three psukim there. It starts with Vayihi kehechel ha'adam l'roiv al pnei ha'adam uvnois yuldu lahem. When men began to multiply on the face of the earth and daughters were born to them. The pasuk continues in Beis. Vayiru v'nei elehim. Now, what that means, we're going to get to. The sons of God is what it sounds like. It's pnei ha'adam. So the daughters of men, they were good, they were beautiful. Vayichul hem nashim mikol asher b'charu. When they chose wives wherever they wanted. Vayomer Hashem, and Hashem said, "Lo yodin ruchi ba'adam." So my spirit will not reside in Adam. Lo'olam b'shagam hu basar. He to his flesh. V'hayu yam of me'er ezim shana. It should be 120 years. Pasuk Dalet. Hanephilim, the Nephilim. Hayu ba'aretz, hayu ba'aretz. B'yam mehim. They were in the land in those days. V'gam acharachin, and also afterwards. Asher yavayu b'nei alehim el b'nei sa'adam. The sons of God came to the daughters of men, v'yoldu and they gave birth. Hema gibayrim, they are the strong or mighty ones. Hashem me'olam anshe Hashem. They're me'olam anshe Hashem, and then it continues that Hashem, Hashem said this is everything not good, etc. So this is where we get to, and I think the question is, and the major machlokes amongst the commentators is when we get to Bnei Elehim, and then we talk about Nephilim. So I'll turn it over to you, Yisroel, to talk about these psukim and where else we see Nephilim in Tanakh.
Yeah, so before we get to defining what the Nephilim are and what the Bnei Elehim are, if you notice in the pasuk says the Nephilim hayu ba'aretz. The Nephilim were in the land. It's interesting to note that the Torah is referring to them as if they're already around, as if there's this ancient tradition to what the Nephilim are that are already present during the times of Tanakh. Now, what the Nephilim are and how to learn up these psukim have a very long historical context that probably went on for, I don't know, till today, I guess. Do we take these verses kipshutai or not kipshutai? Do we take them literal or do we take them not literal? Now, even what does literal mean could have multiple viewpoints, and that's obviously what we're here to discuss. So, at some point in time, I guess we'll jump to the book of Chanoich. During Bayesheni, there was a tradition that they understood that Malachim came down to Shemayim, and they are the Bnei Elohim. Now, who these Malachim are and what they are and how they exist, we'll get to. But these Malachim these angels marry the daughters of man. Who are the daughters of man? It doesn't even say daughters of man. It says the daughters of the man. Ha'adam. They have children. And these children end up being the Nephilim. Or the Nephilim are the angels that fell, or their children are the Nephilim. That we'll see. But that, in a nutshell, is the original tradition, or the original story of these fallen angels.
So, okay, well, you mentioned a couple different things over there. So the books of Chanoich is the book of Enoch. We'll get to, and we'll talk about what that is. But to the Psukim for a minute. Who defines what Bnei Elohim and Nephilim is? And I mean, we could say the Pirkei Belazar, I think, says it is. They are angels, fallen angels. Rashi, Ramesh Darshan, Rashi says it's not. Sons of Judges. What is going on over there? Define a little bit some terms from the Mefarshim.
Yeah. So the exact translation of Hanephilim seems to be a big debate, even what the literal reading of the text means. It ranges from opinions that those who fell, or it can mean giants. I see over here that Barbanel and Tzuramor have like these exotic translations that the babies fell out of their mother's womb, or they did magic to abort the fetuses, like Nephil. Obviously, because it's such a mysterious topic, you have no shortage of these very far out there opinions.
Okay, and when you get to the opinion of Rashi...
Yeah, so Rashi's very interesting. Rashi does not mention anything about the fallen angels in Bereshis. It's not until Parsha Shlach, where the spies meet the Nephilim, that Rashi does cite this medrash. And it's obviously worth noting that why does Rashi, purposely skip it out, considering that Ramosha Darshan, we'll get to, is one of the main sources for the Medrash. So I have my theory that I discuss, but it's definitely worth noting.
Okay, so you mentioned the interesting opinions, that's Ramar, Barbanel, etc., and in your book you do go through more of this, even the different various opinions about what Nephilim can mean. So, but the point I think we see here with Bnei Elohim and Nephilim is that not everybody learns that these are fallen angels.
Correct. So now, the question is, and at what point in time did we stop accepting the Sefer Chanoich? So, like we'll see, the Gemara, in Talmud Bavli, the story of the Nephilim, I think, is mentioned twice. Once in Nida, and once in Yuma. We'll get to, Shem Chazoi, V'Adal. The Gemara mentions this, like, just 2 times, so we don't have really many texts. Obviously, the Midrashim are even less than that, like, just Medrash Rabbah, I think the Gemara, the Medrash Rabbah quotes from Shimon Bar Yochai as having cursed anyone who would say the Bnei Elohim are sons of angels. So at some point, Chazal really didn't want to discuss the Nephilim as having anything to do with Malachim marrying humans. So for sure, by the time we get to the Rishonim, most of them try to avoid this entire topic. But that being said, there's always traces of these Nephilim belonging to the Bnei Elohim, literally the sons of angels.
Now, so really we see it a lot in the Zohar and Pirkei Belazar. That's where we find out that they are being considered fallen angels. So the other thing that comes up is, if we are going with the opinion that they're fallen angels, there are names of the angels, correct? There are names of these fallen angels of the Nephilim, the fallen angels, Azael, Shem Chazi, a bunch of other ones.
Right. Those are the names that the Gemara quotes. I think the book of Enoch has different names for these fallen angels. And eventually they become associated, like that's already a later step, how they become associated with the Rephaim. I think the Medrash says that they have 7 names. Anakim, Rephaim, Giborim, and all these different inhabitants of the land of Canaan, the land of Eretz Yisrael, become associated with the Nephilim. Eventually we'll go through the entire story, how we see Oig. Oig is the Yeser Rephaim, the last survivor of the Rephaim. He's connected to the Acha, a son of Shem Chazoi.
Yeah, and we'll get more to that. So really, you mentioned about the Chanoich, the book of Enoch, so that ends up in Sfarim Chetzonim, in the Apocrypha, and that's not part of our tradition, but it ends up, I know in the Christian tradition, I think it's a big deal, right? It still is.
So it's funny, the same type of conversation that the Jews were having about the Sefer Chanoich and these type of topics, the Christians themselves were always having. And the same way these books were banned from Tanakh, they also end up getting banned from the Christian tradition. And for the most part, the Sefer Chanoich, or the Book of Enoch, was lost. Until 1773, when a guy named James Bruce returned to Europe from Abyssinia, and he found it in the Gez version. It's funny, the Beta Israels, the Ethiopians, they did keep this book as part of their canon. Because even an Ethiopian now in Toronto, who I met, and I asked him, do you believe in the Sefer Chanoich? In Avada, that's part of their Tanakh.
Yeah, you said Abyssinia. That refers to Ethiopia. So that's interesting. And yeah, definitely now it becomes more accessible. So as you say, what's the story there, if you want to see more about the story that comes out in this book of Chanoich, of Enoch, and that, as you say and you argue in the book, that even though it's Chazal kept it out, we don't have it. We do see it, there's hints of it. Again, Rashi doesn't even talk about it there in Bereshit, but in Bamidbar he does, and it does, you argue that it kind of underlies, it's kind of in the background of certain parts.
Yeah. So it's very interesting, you have to always understand, like the zeitgeist and the timing of every single mefarish, that depending on when you lived and where you lived and, who your opponents were, you either were tolerant of this idea or not tolerant. Now, for some reason, because of whatever was going on during Bayis Sheni, perhaps they were being influenced by the different Greek cultures, they obviously focused more on these type of topics. So the Book of Enoch was one of these books written during Bayis Sheni that discusses a vision that Chanoich had, where the angels tell him about the flood that's going to take place. And the purpose of the flood is really to kill or to wipe out the entire, I guess, Bnei Cain, or the entire Nephilim line, or the entire Nephilim heritage, because they were the ones that corrupted man. So that's, for the most part, the Book of Chanoich.
So there's really a bunch of other things, and I think throughout this podcast we're going to bounce back and forth between history and Torah, and there's a lot of different things, and this is what you do in the book as well. There are a number of things. I don't know where you want to go from here. There's this part of the story is, we'll go back to Pasuk Bereshis, which is part of the story is, if you're going to go with the Mahalach, that not that they were the sons of judges, like Rashi said, but you're going to go with the Mahalach, they were fallen angels. So then they have a union with the humans. That's what happens, and they have offspring, is kind of what happens, correct?
Correct. So you want to know, I guess, how that gets to be? Again, that's always going to be the question that you can't answer.
Yeah. This is exactly.
That's part of myth. There's always a point you're like, exactly what goes on or exactly what happens. But the idea of giants, the idea of there being this large, factual, pre-Mabul race seems to be something that many people believed in. There's a Tiferes Yisroel that's, for example, has a very, I would say, controversial drasha that you get in Leibniz that's known for Drusha Archaim. It's published in the back of the Mishnayos in Sanhedrin. There he discovers about these, he talks about the bones, the dinosaur bones that were discovered. And, he assumes because there's such large dinosaur bones, so there has to be large human bones. So, depending on where you were in time, so he, for example, had no problem believing in, that this factual event of these large giants. Other Achronim, had other, these ideas of these gigantic pre-flood race. I know the Malbim and Tziv, all had these different opinions that, there was a different world before the Malbim. Obviously they were influenced by things going around in their times, where, I forget what it was called, but, these ideas that there was this great flood and that changed, the nature of Earth. Again, others refused to believe these things. To the extent that, you have, I say that in my book, the Chazon Ish, one time, a bacher came to his house and, didn't believe in the story of Oig, thought it wasn't literal, had the wine removed. But if you go to the Rajba's times, where they're having different debates about Oig and giants and what do the Jews believe, and the Rajba has no issue saying that he never picked up this large mountain. Obviously, we'll get to it. It could be it was a bunch of stones that Oig decided to throw. You
mentioned the Tiferes Yisroel and his drasha. It's interesting, there was an English translation done a while ago, but now there was a new English translation with a heavily annotated edition. It came out called Drush Archaim, Seek Out the Living Light. And that was published by Targum Press. It's actually often on sale on Amazon. It's like massive. It became like 400 pages. It's a whole big deal out of it. So that is that's the drush of the famous.
That's the reason why
straw that you're referring to.
Don't learn. They cover the Yachin and Bayaz, I'm sure you know.
So yeah, so that's like you're saying, but that really comes from, was there this gigantic pre-flood race, pre-Mabel of like dinosaur people, essentially?
Correct. Obviously, like I write in my book, there's obviously always these hoaxes. They had the Cardiff giant where some guy decided to make one and people got all excited. We finally found the Nephilim. But I think it's good to clear up that to date, I hope I'm not going to get in trouble for this, there is no evidence for any large race. Obviously, the Medrash, we have so many stories. The Medrash, we have Rabbi Yochanan saying that he found the thigh bone and it's 18 amas, and you have a lot of these types of Mekaris and Chazal, which obviously is emes, and we're not debating any of that. But the point is, today, scientifically, right now, there are no evidence for any large human species that existed at any time.
Okay, but looking at, like we said, we all know, everyone knows growing up from a young age, Oig, right? Oig comes up all the time. Everyone knows, but Oig the giant, right? And Oig getting, Goliath, of course, also, how could we forget? So there are a number of giants that we know of, that and the connection of the giants to the Nephilim.
Yeah, so that sort of takes like a natural progression. We'll get to this. It's interesting, the story of Oig, which I'm sure most of your listeners are going to be familiar with, does not make its way in the Svarim Chitzonim. There is no mention of Oig. There's no giant that survives the Mabul. But in Chazal, there's a lot of Oig, right? Whatever we lack in Nephilim, we make up for in Oig. So Oig is this giant that becomes the king of Bashan, right? And he survives somehow the flood. We'll get to that, obviously. And he ends up being the last of the Rephaim, right? He's the last survivor of this entire tradition. Perhaps Goliath ends up being the last one. And yeah, even by Oig, we have this big machlokes, right, about what his size is and how big he is, etc.
Right, and as you said, we'll get more to the connection. Again, going with Rashi doesn't go with the whole Bnei Elohim, Nephilim thing as being fallen angels. Now, did we mention the Rashi and Bamidbar? Rashi and Bamidbar does. Rashi and Bereshit says, no, Bnei Elohim, judges, they were corrupt, because of that whole thing. And Nephilim, that's what he talks about there. Nothing about fallen angels. Rashi and Moshe Darshan. Then we come to Bamidbar, and Rashi makes mention. I don't know if we mentioned this. Maybe we should mention this here. It is a little different.
Yeah, no, I said this. I think that Rashi purposely ignored it in Sefer Bereshit. This is one of the theories of my book. Rav Moshe Darshan ended up being quoted by a Christian scholar who used Rav Moshe Darshan against the Jews. It was like a new style of debate in that era where they were using Jewish sources to debate, using Midrashim. Like literally this Martini, this Galach quotes Rav Moshe Darshan to use it in debate against the Jews. I think it's safe to say that Rashi didn't want to put this into Bereshis and waited till Shlach to use this. There's also a Rashi on the Gemara where he also mentions the myth of the fallen angel.
So we mentioned some of the sources that discuss these Nephilim, the fallen angels. And I guess we're going with that opinion here in this conversation. So you mentioned the books of Enoch and the vision and how it was written and all that and what was going on. But what about other early sources that discuss Nephilim? Jewish sources.
Yeah. So what we have in the Jewish sources, we have the Sefer HaZayir, right? Obviously, he's a big proponent of this myth. There's no shortage of mentions of Nephilim in the Zayir. The Zohar also quotes a Sefer Chanoich of interesting. I don't know what Sefer Chanoich he quotes, but he quotes it often. And there's the Pirkei Reb Lezer, right? The Pirkei Reb Lezer is one of the biggest sources for this story. And I obviously made extensive use of the Pirkei Reb Lezer. But each one of these books doesn't have the complete story, if that makes sense. Even the Zohar and even the Sefer Chanoich and even the Yalkut Shimoni that quotes Rav Moshe Darshan all use parts of it. The purpose of my book is to try to develop the entire story from the beginning throughout Tanakh.
So, there's a lot of different ways. Now, I think we could go from here because there's a lot of different things, like I said, historically and Torah, and they're really intertwined. And that's really what you do in the book. So I mean, I don't know which angle you want to continue on over here to talk about. In Bereshis, the Nephilim come up. We have the Mabul, the Tower of Babel. It comes up. Perhaps we should go there. You have different. The Nephilim comes up differently in different places. So perhaps you want to talk a little bit about where we see more of the Nephilim, where we you mentioned the source, but where we actually see them coming up in Medrash and other places.
Yeah, so even though the Medrash doesn't, even though the Medrash and the Gemara, as we said, doesn't directly talk about the Nephilim, but they definitely make use of some of the trimmings, for lack of a better word, around and around this entire topic. So the question is, in the Medrash, let's say, where would be the first place to look for the Nephilim? Right, so the first thing that we see is when Hashem came to make mankind. This is like the first story of every Medrash. Gemara brings it, right? The Malachim tell Hashem, Ma enosh kisiskirena, what's the point of making man? Right? So the Medrash says that Hashem tells the Malachim, or he pushes them away, or whatever it is, he goes ahead and makes man. Then in one version comes along when the Rechatu and the Dar Enosh, or the times of the Mabul, they come back to Hashem and say, look, didn't we tell you not to make man? So Hashem says, you go down to earth and you live as they live, and we'll see how you guys will behave. And they obviously go down there, and that's when they meet the daughters of man, which, by the way, in the Chumash, in the context of the Chumash, it's right during Dar Enosh. That's where the story first comes in. And that's sort of the response of Hashem to the Malachim by saying, you go down there, and then we see they go down and they end up ultimately misbehaving. So this, I think, is the very, traditional, or this is the version that almost all the Midrashim have.
What about that makes it sound like there's other versions that are a little different than this standard
so Rashi
version.
just says that they came down b'mei Yered. I know there's different, I got an email today also trying to define if there's any type of consensus of exactly when does the story start. Does the story start on the fourth day? Does it start, when the sun and the moon? Does it start with the Chet Adam Marishan? It's very hard when you deal with these types of topics to put a direct timeline. I tried at one point to try to make a timeline, but whatever it is, the beginning part of this idea is that as soon as man shows up, there's the idea of Kitrug. The Abish, the Malachim come along and say, we don't want this. This is something that's no good. And the response to this is, you go down, you live like they live, and you'll see that you're not going to behave any better. Now, in the version of the myth, there's a very interesting story. Now, obviously, they live with the daughters of man, they marry the Bnei Kayin, right? They populate the world, and this is what ends up being the cause of the Mabul and all the other destructions in Sefer Bereshis. But there's a maiden, there's one woman who she doesn't sin with the angels. And as a reward, right, how she doesn't, or how she gets away with them is there's two versions. One version is she takes their wings. Another version is she says the same Shem Mefarish, and she's able to fly away. She flies up to Shemayim, and she becomes part of either Koich of Kima or Ishtar. She becomes a star, or she becomes planet Venus. We'll see about that later. But that's the story. There's always one that the Malachim will sin, and the one who doesn't sin. And that happens at the beginning of the creation.
What's see later? Why don't you say more about that here? I'm sure listeners want to hear. So where does that come from, that source, that this one who doesn't sin but flies away and she becomes planet Venus? What's up with that?
So that, we'll get to that. That is cited by the Rosh al Torah. I don't know if you have a Chumash there. In Parshas Vayishlach. When Yaakov goes to sleep by the ladder, in the dream, the maiden uses Yaakov Avinu's ladder to go up to Shemayim and to mixing up again. The Malachim that fell down used Jacob's ladder to ascend back to heaven, which is a very integral part of the myth, the idea of tshuva, and the idea of being able to reconcile, even though the Malachim fell down and they ultimately get destroyed, there's always a way of correcting themselves at the end, and there's always the human concept here, how they're able to help the Malachim achieve their status.
Another thing here is I think we've kind of alluded to this, we haven't mentioned this, is Kabbalah versus rationalism in the place of the Nephilim in this story. You mentioned the Zohar, how an integral part, not an integral part, but the Zohar many times mentions the Nephilim, and it comes up, many times, Medrash and other things. But when it comes to rationalism, that's not necessarily the case, as one can imagine, thinking of, what type of thing we're talking about, angels coming out to earth, and union with humans and giants and those type of things. But what role does that play that you've seen in your research in the Nephilim myth being popular, staying in, being in and out of popularity, essentially?
Right. So it's very interesting. Like, normally rationalism would mean that when you say the words B'nai Elohim, you mean the sons of judges, right? You mean you want to be a rationalist. You're obviously going to refute any of these type of stories that don't make any sense, because after all, how do humans, cohabitate? How do they live with angels? But at one point, there was a Talmud of the Rambam, Rabbi Yankiv of Anatoly. I think he was the father-in-law of Rabbi Yehuda ibn Tibbon, the one who translated all the Rambams to Lashon Kodesh. He was a Talmud of the Rambam, and he had no issue understanding all these mythical stories as a side. Like, he didn't have to dismiss any ideas of the fallen angels, because he knew. So it's interesting, depending on where you stand, does your rationalism allow you or tolerate, this side, this type of esoteric idea, or not? There was other Rishonim, like Rav Hillel of Verona. He denied it vehemently. He didn't want to accept any of these type of stories. The Malbim, literally, every piece in Bereshis is busy, don't believe any silly, stupid mythologies. It's all nonsense. He doesn't want to accept anything. The Malbim was a great Kabbalist. There's no reason for him to have denied, unless he was out to make a point, which I'm sure he was in his commentary.
Malbim's commentary was one of those famously at the same time as the Netziv, Aksav Kabbalah, Rav Hirsch, fighting against Haskalah, and that, but interesting, it was like maybe he felt that would be going too far. People wouldn't, I don't know. I've
never know. You could
analyzing
only
the Malbim.
Speculate, yeah.
Yes, all complete speculation, but it's just interesting to note, as you say there. So, getting back to the story itself, though, it's interesting you mentioned Cohen, and there's an interesting opinion about Cohen, Cohen himself, that comes up over here when we're referring to this story, and then we should really talk about Lilith as well, because she's important also.
Yeah, so try to, avoid all this super controversial stuff. In one opinion is...
Leave that to the book.
What?
We'll leave that to the book.
Yeah, but there's one interesting medrash that kind of claims that Adam had 2 chavos. So interesting how much they don't teach you in school, huh? But the medrash says that what Cain and Hevel really fought about, right? Obviously, we're taught they fought about karbanos, and that's very true. I'm not obviously denying it, but that's not the first opinion in the medrash. The first opinion in the medrash is that they were fighting over the first Cain, of the first chava. They fought over the first chava. So Adam had another chava. What does that mean? So there is, I think the Rishonim in the Gemara also talk about this first chava. But there was a first chava that got pregnant from the Samach Mem, Samol, another potential fallen angel who gave birth to Cain. So Cain really, as we'll see in this story, is considered the bad son from Adam and Chava. And eventually we'll see the whole Mabul story, and the entire story is really about killing out the Bnei Cain. So that's the first story. Lilith is about a second wife that Adam had, which Zohar quotes this from an old document. And I think they gave birth to all the Shadim and the Ruchas, all these types of things. But again, the point that I'm trying to make is not to get, there's a sefer called Oitzer Plois HaTorah, right? You've heard that? So that sefer likes to quote all this crazy stuff. And I love it also, and I grew up with it, and I'm telling you, I grew up with the State Ardayers, and now I see they printed, the Shalshelis HaKabbalah. You were?
Who printed the Shalshelis HaKabbalah?
Just reprinted it now. Wasn't on your email?
No, I didn't see the new Shalshelis HaKabbalah. Shalshelis HaKabbalah, Gedaliah ben Yachia, that has a lot of interesting things there.
So there they have stuff, like humans coming from apes, all that, apes coming from humans, all reverse Darwinism. So the point of what I'm trying to get is that there's no shortage of crazy topics. But to stay on the focus, when you learn Sefer Bereshis, there seems to be like three different stories, right? There's the Mabul, there's Dor HaFloga, there's Dor Enosh, right? First, Dor Enosh is the ones who start Avodah Zarah, right? Then you get Dor HaFloga that does something, they build the tower, right? Or maybe they're after the Mabul. I'm getting confused again. And then you have Dor HaFloga where they build this giant tower, right? And then you have Stein. So is there any connection? Is there any rhyme or reason between these four stories, or they just line up coincidentally? So when you study myth, the idea, the purpose of the myth is that stories repeat themselves. What happens with Adam and Cain happens again in the times of Tuval Cain, which is the Dar. Not the Dar HaFloga, right? That's the first destruction, right? Hashem destroys a third of the world, or you have the ocean flood the whole world. And then you get to the Mabul, which is even a greater disaster. And then you get to, after the Mabul, they build this tower, right? Why are they building Migdal Bavel? So they're obviously trying to fight this Mabul story, right? But why would they build a Migdal? Like, that wouldn't be a smart idea, no? Isn't that like a weird, that if you're going to worry of a flood, so maybe they'll climb on top of it, no? That's what I was taught in school. They're going to climb on top of the Migdal, right? I mean, I don't know how much that's going to work for rain going on for 150 days. And then we get this done. So Yosifus quotes a very interesting tradition, and it's found in the Malbim the Rashbam brings this wording, that they had a tradition from Adam that in addition to the Mabul of Mayim, there's going to be a Mabul of Esh. And the Rebbe Bachya brings this also. The purpose of the Migdal Bavel was to protect them from fire. Now, it's fascinating that it doesn't take place during the time of Migdal Bavel, right? We don't find any fires, right? We have maybe a fire by the Mabul, there's referencing to fire. But where fire does take place is in the time of Stein. And the Rashbam there says that the reason why Lot married his daughters is because Kasavru Mabul Shalesh Yard Eloilam. They thought there was a flood of fire. So you see that this tradition of destruction, which according to the Sefer Chanoich, and even according to the people who don't believe in the Nephilim story, all agree that the Bnei Cain were the ones that had to get eradicated for corrupting mankind. That all takes place in the Sefer Bereshis. So you have a kind of like an overview how these ideas keep on repeating themselves.
Let me ask you something. Go off script for a second, which is, meaning of what we've been talking about, trying to focus on one thing, but just taking a step back, something that you mentioned a few minutes ago was that, you're not Eitzer Place Torah, you're not a collection. The book isn't a collection of just weird, crazy fantasies, and not even fantasies, but midrashim and outlandish opinions in the Chumash. So, I mean, in some sense, isn't that what the book is? What is the book trying to do? What are you trying to do here in this sense?
So, like I say, the purpose is to try to find an underlying current, a theme that exists, a story that exists from Bereshis all the way to the last book of Tanakh. And as we'll go through different things, we see a repeat of these ideas of Nephilim, where they sort of come up again, whether it's in the book of Yoav, or the book of Daniel, the book of Esther. Obviously, it's not explicit. Like we said, Chazal, put the Sefer Chanoich in Cherem, right? It wasn't meant to be known. And for the most part, it isn't well known. But myth, like the human consciousness, it always has a way to survive. Like, you can't get rid of it. That's the funny thing about it. Like, we'll see when it comes to Yom Kippur. As much as we don't believe in this myth, and as much as we're trying to avoid it, it always does creep up again. It always does come back again to the human conscience.
Now, why is myth important? I'm sure many listeners are listening to this. We've been saying a lot of weird and fantastical things that maybe they didn't hear of. But why is myth important? Why should they know these sources and this story?
The myth is a story. The purpose of a story is to help mankind make sense of the ununderstandable. We all have our questions. Philosophy has long books, quote Leibniz and all these other great philosophers. Each one has long explanations for all why we do what we do. But I think what myth comes into play is that myth, with a simple story, helps you make sense of some of the most difficult questions. Especially like, where do we come from? What's the purpose of man? Or how does man exist in this world? You know, man as the savior to the Malachim, where if not for humans, if not for us, if not for people, you know, there's literally no reason to be here. I think these type of difficult ideas get encompassed in the story of myth.
So, you know, you mentioned a couple of times that, you know, we see this throughout Bereshis and throughout different sources. So, not only Bereshis, and then some other things that we should pick up and discuss. You know, obviously, there's later than Bereshis, Meraglim, the giants come up over there going to Yisroel. There's David and Goliath. We mentioned Goliath in brief passing. You mentioned already Yom Kippur. There's going to be some other ones. So I think we should, you know, start with some of those that are familiar to everybody. And again, those are getting, when we talk about Meraglim and giants, the connection to the Nephilim, you know, and what part the Nephilim play in the story there.
Yeah, so there's three main characters that I think that sort of are the Jewish version of the heroes, right? The Nephilim, the giants, were always the heroes. You know, I just saw now this week, I don't know when this week is going to be, but I just saw in Parshas V'Eschanan, the Meshech Chochmah quotes that they put Oig's bed in Rabbas, right? Rabbas ben Almin, right? So you know why Oig's bed, I just saw it's not in my book. You know why Oig's bed was in Rabbas? Because it was on display. He quotes the human worshippers of China. I never knew the Meshech Chochmah knew about such a thing. He also quotes some Greek literature. I never knew that he knew about such a thing. And he says that there was on display. It's a very interesting. Humans like a hero, right? The idea of hero. Heroes is one of the main characters of myth. In the Jewish version, I think there's three people that get evaluated or get summed up to the giants. Avram, Moshe, and David. Avram, we'll see in the Medrash, where the Eibishter tells the Malachim, when God tells the tells the angels, like, what's man and who's man and what do we need them for? He uses Avram as an example of someone who was able to overcome his own desires and his own, lackings to become on the level of an angel. So does Moshe. Moshe, I think the Tanakh of Aliyah, the last piece in it, before Moshe dies, Hashem also evaluates him with the Nephilim. And David will see also, right, he attacks Goliath. So it's interesting, the Rosh Tevis, so these are Adam, right, of Ram, David, and Moshe, right? So we have this idea, this grandiose idea of the Torah version of giants. In each part of history, we see each one of them attacking the giants, right? So Adam, we'll start with Avram, right? Avram fights the battle with the 4 kings against the 5 kings, and he's able to overcome these kings, and he's ultimately gifted Oig, or he takes Oig captive. But this is the first time where we see Avram Avinu taking charge of the giant. And I've noticed that when he does that, he's really conquering the land of Eretz Yisrael that Moshe will sort of repeat later on, right? So this is where you have the same type of story repeating itself between Avram, Moshe, and David, where each one kills the giant in order to be able to conquer the land that they're going to inherit. The story, the story of the giants really reappear in Sefer Bamidbar. It's always interesting, right? It's always a connection with the land. That's what we find in the Nephilim. The Nephilim are connected to Har Hermon. In the book of Enosh, the book of Enoch, the Nephilim come down on Mount Hermon. And we see in the Psukim, there's many different names, and it's this highly complicated mountain, right? Rashi even quotes Lashon Knan of snow, right? Mount Shnir. I don't know if they own skiing, but that's where Har Hermon, that's when the Nephilim came down on. And Moshe, before he goes into Eretz Yisrael, he sends out these spies to, take a look at the land. So right away, they come to Eretz Yisrael, and guess who they meet? They meet the giants. So who's the father of these giants? Targum is in Ephraim. Ephron is the father of the giants. What Ephron is the father? How does that come to place? But I think it's easy because once we see Avram interacting with them, right, when he buys a plot for his wife and eventually befriends them and helps them out, then the same thing should happen later on with the Moshe and the giants themselves. In other words, Mitzad Echad, they should have realized that the land is promised. There's no need to badmouth the land. But they don't. And the Medrash has a very interesting Medrash. The Medrash says that in honor of them calling Avram a Nasi Alekim, a prince, a godly prince, they merited that their land was delayed, the conquer of their land was delayed for 40 years. So we see that that's the first episode of the Nephilim. There's obviously so much more to discuss. There's Michal, Machel, and Canaanite mythology. There's literally like an infinite amount to talk about over here. There's one medrash that Taisus brings that spies hidden this peel, and the daughter of the giant, whose name is also of note, Anak or Anat, gets scared and she throws the peel over the fence, and the spy is able to escape. Obviously, these types of things require a lot more study and what exactly the Midrashim are alluded to. That's the first part of the Nephilim and Shmos, in Bamidbar rather. Then we have Moshe and his attack of Sichon and Og. Now this is very note. The Medrash says that this takes place during the months of Elul and Tishrei. It's interesting, the Rekeach says that, if you hold a Sukkos Mamish, right, if there was literal huts, why were they building literal huts? What was the need? Aren't they in the Midbar? Why were they building? What was the point? So the Rekeach says it was to protect them from the attacks of Sichon and Og. So this is already getting more into the timing of these events. So it's interesting to note that these events take place in the months of Elul and Tishrei. So what happens is we are first introduced to Bilam. So Bilam, according to the Targum and the Midrashim, is also Lavan, which is interesting because they both learned their magic from the Nephilim. Right, Lavan had the Trophim. Trophim, look it up, is a very unpleasant type of magic. Ayin Sham. But the same way Lavan tries to stop Yankiv from continue building the Bnei Yisrael, it's Bilam who tries to stop Moshe and the Bnei Yisrael of conquering the land. Now, Bilam has a very good idea. He suggests that the Moabite daughters and the Midianites commit sin with the Bnei Yisrael, entice them to do Baal Par, right? And this takes place again on Mount Hermon, right? That's the city, that's the mountain where the Nephilim come down on. So they're also reenacting this Nephilim where the Nephilim sinned with the daughters of men. And what happened as a result is Moshe gets buried facing Baal Par. That's a very beautiful Taisus. Taisus also in sight that brings the Medrash that there's a yearly cycle. Every year at this time, which is obviously going to be between Elul and Tishrei, Baal Pa'or rises himself up to be Mekatrig on the Bnei Yisrael. And Moshe is buried in Chutz La'aretz specifically for this purpose, to knock down Baal Pa'or and not allow the Baal Pa'or to be Mekatrig. So obviously this is going to tie into a later story of Yom Kippur and Tishrei that occurs every single year, the idea of Chet and Tshuva. But these are the two main episodes in Parashas Bamidbar and Sefer Bamidbar where we see that in order to conquer the land, you have to also conquer the Nephilim. And Moshe obviously becomes the ultimate hero. And the Medrash, in the end of Medrash Rabbah, the end of this famous Medrash, where they say that Hashem tells the Malachim, what do you mean? Is anybody like Moshe who was able to not live with his wife for 40 years? Look at the Nephilim. You guys went down right away and you were able to sin. Look at Moshe. Moshe didn't. That's the story of Bamidbar.
Okay, now we come to the part of David and Goliath.
Yeah, so that leads us into the story of David and Goliath. The Medrash says that Moshe never said a shira over the victory of Sichon and Og. It was David who was the one to say shira on it. And that he says in the Hal HaGadol, right? Sichon Melech HaMori, like Melech HaBasham. Now the reason why I thought that Moshe never said Shira is because the job was never done, right? It's not till David kills Goliath, who, by the way, according to one medrash, is a son of Shimshon HaGibor. That already is another out there medrash. It's not until that time where the story becomes complete. Now, there's a lot of fascinating, stories with David and Goliath. There's one very interesting thing that ties into the story of Bris Milah. David was accused of taking Bathsheba's wife, right? The Gemara obviously says that Kol Omer David Chata in Alataya. But what's this relationship between David and Uriah? So according to the Medrash, I think it's cited by the Prisha in Hilchos Bris Milah, he says the following: that David didn't know how to take off Goliath's armor, right? He knocked him down with the stone. He didn't know how to take off the armor. And he asked Uriah, who was Goliath's armor carrier, for help. And he said, only if you promise me a wife from the Bnei Yisroel. So David said, sure. So Hashem told David, you promised the wife, he's going to take your wife. What's interesting is that the Prisha says that as a reward for metal, for helping David, you're only supposed to do a bris with metal, even though you could use anything. And it's funny, the Rambam also brings this, you should only use metal. Again, we have these ideas tying back, and again, according to the Pirkei Der Blazer, Avram is mal himself, he does his bris on Yom Kippur. So the idea of controlling your taivus and the idea of being able to, repent from your sin all ties back together to this story.
So as we're moving now through the different stories that are related, we have two more. Well, one is a story, one is not exactly a story. The one story now, Esther, and then there's what you've mentioned a couple times, not a story, is Yom Kippur. The story of Yom Kippur, but Yom Kippur, let's call it. So let's start with Esther first.
Yeah, so Esther is very interesting. Esther wasn't her real name, right? Her real name was Hadassah. Chazal gave her, the Goyim called her Esther. It's very interesting. We go by her Goyish name, Good luck getting into school in Lakewood, no? But what is this Ishtar, right? Ishtar, the Gemara says, it's after Kaich of Noiga, right? The planet Venus. So Ishtar, as we spoke about, was the angel who refused the advances, was the woman, was the Benoisa Adam who refused the advances of the sinning with the fallen angels, and ultimately was rewarded to become part of the stars. Now it's interesting that Daniel is responsible for Esther's rise to power. Right? Hatach, Daniel, Memuchan Daniel. And this is a whole nother story that doesn't either make it into the Tanakh, right? There's called the Book of Daniel, where Daniel slays a dragon. Somehow this is connected to him getting into the furnace. There's a lot of complicated stories, and I'm just trying to relay the one point that Chazal bring down. Chazal do bring this story of Daniel slaying the dragon, which is Marduk, which either may or may not be connected to Mordechai. There's a beautiful picture of this amazing Babylonian dragon, and how Daniel did it is also fascinating. He put pitch with straw and lit it and swallowed it and blew it up. But Chazal put this story on the same verse where Yankov Avinu helps the angels ascend to heaven. Where that verse where the Malachim used Jacob's ladder to ascend, that's where the Medrash puts in this story of Daniel. It's fascinating stuff. And again, like Avram, Daniel's thrown into the furnace. But the main story of Purim is which is important, is that where normally what Esther did would be considered a sin, but because she did it to save Klal Yisrael, it's not only not a sin, it's the greatest thing that could be done to save the Jewish people. So Purim ultimately becomes known like Yom Kippurim, right? It's like Yom Kippur. And the reason for that is because we're able to overcome our desires and overcome whatever it is that we lack. And that's the idea I found that's interesting. A tzaddik, out of all Svarim, one sefer that should mention this idea that's why your Purim is connected to Yom Kippur, is because Queen Esther does not sin, just like the original fallen angels. This naturally leads into the story of Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur really ties together this entire book, I guess, if that makes sense, everything gets tied into Yom Kippur, whether it's the Shaffer of Rosh Hashanah, which we could talk about, but the main point is that there's two karbanos that we bring on Yom Kippur, right? One Lashem and one Lazazel. So there's interesting period of Blazer, right? Obviously that we're bringing the carbon for Hashem, like as if Hashem needs a carbon. Obviously this has been super, super controversial. How could Hashem do a chet? But every Sari Rish Chodesh is really a kapara for Hashem. Now the question is, what chet did Hashem do, and what is the kapara that we're bringing him help? So in addition to the carbon Hashem, we also bring a carbon to Azazel. And the Ramban is very busy. The Ramban, it's interesting, also has his own, sequence of when he does quote the Azazel, when he doesn't quote the Azazel. So in Parshas Vayikra on the Achim, he does quote the Pirkei Blazer, and he says that is the correct pshat in the Azazel, and it's a sheichad, it's a bribery for the Malach HaMavis, the Samach Mem, the Yetzer Hara, not to be mekatrik. So we have these two ideas. The question is, what are these two things symbolize? And the symbolizes that yes, mankind does sin. Mankind is very vulnerable. But at the end of the day, mankind can also do tshuva. And mankind go so far and help the celestial beings revolve back to their original place. Nachi, what do you think about my book? Let's be honest.
So, that you're putting me on the spot here.
Just darshan for a full hour.
In that, listen, we've had a conversation here for an hour. I read the book, not like, with a magnifying glass, kind of skim read the book. I found it to be very interesting. But something that I want to ask you, something that I feel here on this episode as well, is it's a little confusing. The subject matter, the structure. I want to ask you, and I mean that to clarify.
Yes.
And maybe let's just help it also. The subject matter does get a little confusing.
It's so confusing. Let me tell you something. This book, I thought, it'd be easy. Yiddish myth, no shortage of books. Go to Yitzra Chachma, go in, HebrewBooks.org, you know what I mean? Boom, write a book. It's so much more difficult to write on this topic than on Egypt. Because Egypt, I'll tell you, Egypt, everything was in front of my face, you know what I mean? Go to Ra, boom, easy. You got this, Osiris, boom, Chazal, Egypt, boom. Here, these ideas are rarely mentioned. Like Chazal did such a good job at covering up the story that literally you need a fine comb. You need a magnifying glass. Like, we didn't even talk about how Yaakov and Esav really represent the Sarah Azazel and the Sarah Hashem. And Esav's a giant. Esav's a Gibor Tzayid. Gibor, he attacks Nimrod. Nimrod is Oig's father. These ideas, like, how does Nimrod become Oig's father? I have no clue. Nimrod, because Oig survived the Mabul, you know what I mean? How did he cut and how does Sichon? We didn't even talk about the beginning. Sichon, Oig's brother, Oig's half-brother. Who's his father? You know what I mean? It's just a web of amazing ideas, and I really challenge the reader, like, get it, Clore. It's on a whole different perspective.
There's that, and the other thing is, so I did enjoy it while I was reading the book, but then chapter by chapter, I'll go, wait, what's the connection of this chapter to the previous chapter? And also, sometimes, I don't know, a lot of the books I do on the podcast are history books. So then it makes sense, right? Either it's going in chronological order from point A to point Z, or it's something that the ideas flow, they click, like you're saying with the Mitzrayim, Midrash, and Myth book that you did, the ideas flow, you're following chronologically in the Torah, where the Torah is going, and like the ideas flow, and you're doing different things, different gods, etc. Here, it's kind of the big globally speaking, it's the Nephilim, and then it's kind of like here,
yes,
there,
it's very
here,
difficult
and there.
Because, like I said, like wherever you're holding, like you're either tolerating this topic, or you're not tolerating this topic. Like Rashi does at one point. You like, yeah, he's okay with the Nephilim. Yeah, they fell down and you may Tuval Kayin. Another place he ignores it. So every Achron and every Rishon, every Medrash has their own. Where like even Ramban, at some points he's okay with the Nephilim, other points he doesn't know about the Nephilim at all. So I'm trying to tell you, it's a topic that's definitely not been explored. Like I had in my English books, there was a guy, Leo Jung, that collected a lot of sources, and there was this guy Bamberger, Fallen Angels, but there was just very limited amount of resources where you're able to okay, let's get all Nephilim all things Nephilim. You know what I mean? Nephilim for dummies.
Yeah, is that what you were trying to do? Were you trying to make the book Nephilim for dummy? Everything possible about Nephilim.
Let me tell you one thing. I was very scared. And I'll tell you, with Mosaica, I got to give them a lot of cars to Toiv. Rabbi Haber, I don't know, you know Rabbi Haber from Mosaica? You ever dealt with him?
I didn't. I was planning on something, and Emergency Hashem, I hope.
Great guy.
I know his son Shuhi is a great guy.
Yeah, Shuhi was different, but Rabbi Haber is the main. He's the Poisik
yes,
of
he's the
Mosaica.
father. He's done exactly.
I'm telling you, I had to remove so many different words, and I had to take off this is too far, and this is too far, and then I needed to get the Haskam, and I'm telling you, Rabbi Breidowitz is the Chacham Mikol Adam, you know what I mean? He was able to literally defend this topic. And even though there were people that initially what do you mean? You're just writing about a Jewish Star Wars, blah, blah, blah. And he was able to mamish, put together, a starker defense. Kol hakavod, Karsa Taif to both those guys for being able to, be civil a lot more.
And that's important because I did forget. I meant to ask you right at the beginning. Last time when the Mitzrayim Medrash Myth book at the beginning, we did talk about Haskamis and how you were putting this out. So here it's really important. Nephilim is really kind of even more out there topic.
Mosaica wouldn't touch without Haskama, and again, Rabbi Breidowitz also was hesitant, but Baruch Hashem, definitely, I can't. No words. Yeah,
and listen, it's definitely an interesting out there topic.
You want to laugh? I got an email today from some guy in Netherlands. I asked him, why the heck did you buy my book? Some dude in Netherlands. He's like, what do you mean? Andrei Orlov said it's a significant contribution. So I'm thankful to him also for, helping me, directing me in this whole vast topic of Apocrypha. There's dozens of books, and then there's the whole story with... There's a whole story with the, Megillas Yamamelech and all the things that reconfirm all these ideas that were found.
It's interesting because when I search on Amazon a lot, and it's for Jewish, or you put in Judaism, or Jewish history, one of the top-selling books, it's always books of Enoch. It's always different. There's always coming up on there.
Yeah, there's so much nonsense. Something. People love UFOs. I mentioned, in a footnote, people want to, know that we're coming from other planets and that, we're all...
Ghosts, Shadim,
we're all transient, and people like the whole, spooky things. There's UFOs. Any UFO videos, automatically guaranteed hit on YouTube. You know what I mean? But the idea is that to avoid all the nonsense and just focus on what the messaging is. I don't know I hope we were able to convey this, that the idea of the Nephilim is really the messaging of what the human purpose is and what the human condition is and how the humans are really responsible for, Tzaddik Befrat is responsible for fixing the highest of the high. And, this is what ultimately ends up, killing David, killing Goliath, Moshe killing Avram, enslaving killing the others. That to me was a very, very important thing.
So what are you working on now? You did
that's
Mitzrayim.
That's a very good kasha. My last book, I think, is going to be my most controversial book. You're not going to believe it. It's on Baba Kama. It's on the other shot of Elohim, the sons of judges. I want to talk about, I'm working on, I have a chavrusa every day with Baba Kama every day. The idea of passing laws and the idea of judging is really a godly proposition, right? It's something that doesn't really come into human form. The idea to punish, but even more so, whenever you go to court, whenever you go to have a dintire or whatever it is, right? You read the Ami articles every week. I'm not going to get into that right now. But how do you know, that you got it right? How do you know that that's the right psak? So ultimately, that's also part of a myth. That's also part of a larger story. Without getting too deep into this, the whole the idea of Baba Kama and trying to understand, a Shartam and a Sharmuad, which Bezdin kept the records? You know what I mean? Was there a Bezdin that had records of Shartams and Sharmuads? I'll just leave it at that. Again, give me 7
Sounds
years.
Interesting, but you said that's going to be your last book. You don't know more planned after that?
We'll see. No, I don't want to. Let's give it a couple years. Let me get back to myself. But I want to tell you, it's been a great hit. I tell you, I get an email every single day about I got your book. Baruch Hashem, I think it's definitely a good read.
Listen, it's definitely an interesting, very interesting topic. And like I said, people like weird. And I know when I posted about it, people are like, wow, that's interesting. Let me check that out. So definitely, I'll put a link in the show's notes and anyone can check it out.
It's not his Lifkin book. It's not one of those types of things.
No, that's not exactly.
Everybody's
it's not
busy,
to do that.
Oh, you could have been a Toronto's Lifkin. You know what I mean? That's not the point. That's not the objective.
Listen, if anything, reading, and tell me if I'm wrong, when I read this book and this conversation, you quote more Torah sources and less non-Torah sources in this book than in the Mitzrayim Medrash book.
100%. The point of this book is to see the story in Chazal, to see the story in the Torah sources, and how even though Chazal tried to hide it, but they leave it, they like hint it here and there, like, here's another medrash.
Okay,
very good.
Well, hopefully listeners found this interesting and enlightening, and they learned something new and read the book. There's even more in the book that they can check out the book, and so I'll put the link to the book in the show's notes. And thank you, Rabbi Shaffer, for joining me once again.